welcome back to Beyond the Checklist, the podcast where we talk about the real world challenges and innovations shaping life sciences manufacturing, as well as the supply chains that support it. I'm Brad Henry, VP of Service Lines at Performance Validation. I'll be your host today. When we think about compliance, product quality, the focus is usually on what happens inside that plant, clean utilities, manufacturing equipment, clean room processes. But the truth is, once a product leaves that facility, the stakes don't go down, and in some facets, they go up. Maintaining product integrity through storage, handling, distribution is just as critical to patient safety and regulatory success. So that's why today we're shifting the conversation to the logistics side of the equation, specifically what it takes for third-party logistics providers or 3PLs to support the highly regulated needs of pharmaceutical medical device companies. I'll be joined today by Sean Merrill. Sean's the Director of Quality at Langham Logistics. Sean started in validation, temperature-controlled environments before moving into this logistics world. It gives him, I think, a really valuable perspective on how to align ops, compliance, and innovation across really both sides of that supply chain. So we're going to talk about what it really means to be a quality-driven logistics partner, how 3PLs can build trust with regulated clients, as well as the role that new technologies are playing in this space. So with that, we'll dive in. Welcome, Sean. Thanks for joining today.
Hey, Brad, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So I guess, starting with your background, like I mentioned, you had some roles in validation, consulting, and now lead quality at a major 3PL. Kind of what pulled you into this compliance world and kind of the path that led to the logistics space?
Yeah, it's interesting. Whenever I first got the questionnaire list, I was thinking about it. It was right around Memorial Day, and that time frame always kind of rings a big bell for me because it was actually the Friday before Memorial Day many years ago that really solidified my career path and into what I am doing today. So I've joked several times over the last couple of months that, most people in quality, at least those that I know and that, the people that I'm close to, I sort of fall into it by accident. It's never your senior year of university and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to go be a quality professional. It's just something that, you fall into and you fall in love with, or at least the people that, stick with it. Right. So, but yeah, several years ago, I was working at a position where I had kind of a hybrid customer service, quality control role. And this was really my first job out of college. I got a call and it was the Friday before Memorial Day, from a customer who was in urgent need of something that we made. And he needed this device in order to get medication to a patient. And he said on the phone to me, Sean, I need this by Tuesday. And if I don't have this by Tuesday, then this patient was gonna die. And it was it was a real eye-opening moment for me because I had, I wasn't too certain at that point about my career path. I knew I wanted to be involved in something that, truly was impactful to people. I knew that I wanted to, support this industry in some fashion. I just didn't know what that would look like. But so that really kind of solidified my role and my goals, kind of moving forward in my career. From there, I actually moved into the sort of the consulting group with that same company. Worked there for many years and started my own firm before I came to Langham. So in my consulting past, I have a pretty strong background working with other logistics companies, 3PL, freight forwarders, ground handlers with airports and others as well. Small startups, and then doing some work for pharmaceutical manufacturing as well. So
Yeah. No, I appreciate that story. I think it's, I say, stories are the things that kind of resonate with people, and something like that has a lasting impact, it kind of, hits the heartstrings, if you will. I think a lot of us have, similar stories. So I appreciate that. Talking about the logistics space, the logistics covers, everything we do, everything we receive. What makes the life sciences part of logistics different than the other portions of that industry?
Yeah, it's interesting because at least in the 3PL side and especially in the transportation side, at least within the U.S., not speaking internationally, like in Europe, there are very well defined regulations around 3PLs, and in the U.S. at least, there's still a little bit of a regulatory gray area. Um, and so, in 2013, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act (DSVSA) was passed, um, and then that essentially Congress giving authority to the FDA to regulate 3PLs, right? Obviously, drug diversion, falsified medications, being a serious supply chain and patient safety issue. Um, but still currently to date, the agency has published draft regulation, issued it for comment 2 or 3 years ago, but has yet to make anything truly official from a regulatory perspective. There are several guidance for industry documents that exist. So basically, the limit to what a 3PL has to do in current state for federal compliance is you have to be licensed in any state that you are domiciled in or that you're doing business in, which means for Langham, as an example, we have a couple of facilities in the Indianapolis area. We have to be licensed in by the Indiana Board of Pharmacy and then any state that we distribute to. That's true for any 3PL that's distributing finished pharmaceutical products or medical devices. And the licensing is a little bit different. So, yeah, I could probably talk about this for the full podcast, but I'll try to keep it short and high level. So it's essentially you have 50 different states and 50 different boards of pharmacy. And so there's essentially 50 different sets of requirements that at any given time you have to comply with. So that does complicate the scope for a 3PL, where, a manufacturer might have, at least on the distribution side, doesn't necessarily have to deal with that level of difficulty. Obviously, the manufacturing regulatory compliance is way more complex than that we deal with.
Yeah, I mean, that compliance challenge, I mean, you talk about customer requirements, you have these regulatory requirements, in some cases, just guidance. As a quality director, I guess, how do you kind of meld all of those together into something that you can manage?
It becomes a challenge. It's a little bit difficult because the objectivity in an audit is really limited to the fact that the auditor is independent of your organization when they come in. Everybody has their own interpretations of regulations and standards, or guidance documents, as an example. There are organizations that treat WHO as gospel, and there are other organizations that treat it as guidance. And you have to be, sort of very mindful of that. But it's really when you look through your quality agreement and you align on, okay, what are the regulations and guidance documents that we mutually agree on, that we are going to abide by. And so you try to find some harmonization in that as much as you can. But, by and large, everybody interprets and applies their own standard to regulations and guidance documents, and you just have to be flexible with that. There are two items that are 2 to 3 items that, everybody always has a very strong opinion about. It's deviation kappa management, change control, and supplier management. Those are the 3 things that you can almost guarantee that, an auditor is going to have something to say when they come in and visit. So,
Um, you know, sitting where you do in the supply chain, have obviously folks upstream and downstream, where you guys sit, so that collaboration is obviously huge. What your experience makes a strong working relationship between manufacturers, QA validation team, and your department, the QA within that 3PL.
yeah, it definitely gets a little bit challenging. The more fingers you have in the cookie jar, the more complex the relationships get. But from my perspective, applying really good, solid project management principles. So having a really well-defined scope from the outset, And then having those kickoff meetings and those regular check-ins is extremely important. To be able to make sure that you have alignment throughout the full duration of your project. Um, those are absolutely imperative, in my opinion. Coming from both sides of it, having been on the side where you currently sit, right, doing this work with others, and then where I am now, where I'm relying on uh, you know y- performance validation or other uh, um, partners to help execute the vast majority of the work. Having those regular check-ins and having a very well-defined scope, is make or break.
See, I guess kind of talking about that, that interface, particularly where PV and Langham have worked together a lot, temperature control. I mean, what are some best practices that you recommend when it comes to qualifying storage areas or the vehicles, things that are handling these temperature sensitive products?
Yeah. First and foremost, I would say follow industry standard guidance. There's a lot of really solid guidance documents that are out there. Um, ISPE Baseline Guide 5 absolutely is essential for new facilities, especially. The revised second edition Good Practice Guide for Controlled Temperature Chambers. They changed the title. I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's that document. Um, and then it really just adhering to industry standard best practices really helps to ensure that the strategy for your commissioning and qualification and temperature mapping are defendable. Um, the second, I would say, is make sure that protocols have a solid rationale for testing strategies, and your report should thoroughly address any deviations, discrepancies, or exceptions that may arise during C&Q or temperature mapping activities. Um, as far as on the temperature control side, for warehouses especially, this often gets overlooked, in other 3PLs I worked with in the past. At Langham, we have done a very good job. We take quality by design very seriously in risk mitigation and management from a facilities design perspective. So a good building automation or building management system is really, really imperative. Gives you that insight into what's happening with the equipment that controls the temperature. Um, you can get, those early alerts if there's something that happens. You get a, critical fan failure or a, motor on an RTU. Something goes wrong. You can mitigate that, dispatch, maintenance, before this thing become a real problem. And the transportation side, real-time monitoring is a big deal. Being able to have that visibility, while product is in transit. One thing that we heavily focus on and that I say, or make a point to say at the beginning, at some point in every meeting, usually at the beginning, is we are at the front lines of patient safety. That is what we do. Um, our job is to make sure that medications are received, they're stored and dispatched, so that the safety, identity, strength, and purity of that product is not compromised, and so that the medication can be safely delivered to the end user. That being said, we also can't forget that external warehousing at 3PLs and transportation are two of the highest risk operations from a product stability standpoint within the pharmaceutical supply chain. So we need to take every measure that we possibly can to mitigate those risks and have good controls in place.
Yeah, when especially we talk about temperature mapping, we're talking about data. I know I've heard, some pharmaceutical manufacturers say, right, we make two things here. We make medicine and we make data.
Mm-hmm.
So, mapping, obviously, thousands of points of data. I guess what's, approach to data integrity? And this is obviously something that, the agency, multiple agencies talk a lot about these days, data integrity in the digital world. So, I guess, approach to managing that when it comes to logistics, whether it's, storage or transit data, working in those GXP environments.
But it's follow Alcala Plus principles, first and foremost. Making sure that you're following data storage and retention guidelines and regulations. That's imperative. From a 3PL perspective, there are just a limited number of records that we have to be very mindful of, and those are distribution records and serialization for finished pharmaceuticals. Um, so we utilize multiple redundant servers to process, store, and archive data, and that really ensures that records are properly preserved and readily retrievable throughout their retention period. We've made a big push over the last few years to move away from paper records. I'd say we're probably about 80 to 85% of the way there. In large part, we do have a very solid mostly paperless system at the moment. But the the idea being your electronic records or paper records or electronically archived paper records, whatever the case may be, need to be stored and archived and retained in such a way that the integrity of those records is not compromised. And we've taken great steps in order to ensure that that happens. We put multiple layers of cybersecurity in place, just to early detect and prevent any type of, malfeasance within our IT infrastructure. And so our internal IT group has done a fantastic job setting us up for success as we grow.
Um, you shared a story earlier, kind of a personal story and your journey into the industry, but thinking in terms of the compliance side of it, to kind of maybe put a real world perspective on some of these compliance issues. Any stories, whether it's from Langham or consultancy role, navigating a tough audit or a tough compliance issue that you can share.
I'd say that maybe the biggest challenge is especially when you're working with smaller to mid-sized pharmaceutical companies who maybe are expanding their operation and they're just starting to work with 3PLs. Maybe they have some on-site warehousing that they've utilized and they're outgrowing that space, and that now they need to engage an extra partner like Langham. That a lot of times they'll want to come in and audit and like you are a manufacturer, and expect you have that same level of, that I had an audit that was within the last 6 to 8 months where they wanted to see our batch records. Like we don't do that. It's not of the scope of what a 3PL does. We're not manufacturing anything, so we would not have that. Um, there have been just some other things as well. Yeah, I could point to various things, but I'd say that's probably the most recent. I'd say more air quote egregious, not really egregious, but just one of those things that there's a gap in understanding. And so there are a lot of times where manufacturers want to apply very strictly the regulations that they have to abide to you. And so, as an organization, you have to pivot and you have to revise your procedures and you have to step your game up, maybe more than you did, mm, maybe, previous iterations of your SOPs and things like that. So, logistics is a relatively simple operation. I say this pretty routinely. We receive items, we store items, and we ship items. And of course, there's the preservation of those items. We have to do so compliantly. And we have to make sure that our inventories, we don't have any type of shrinkage, and we're not losing things and misplacing items or misshipping things like that. But by and large, comparatively speaking, it's a relatively simple operation. So the big thing, again, as far as compliance is concerned with a 3PL is we still are in that little bit of a regulatory gray area, where, the FDA certainly can, and has, walked into 3PLs and performed an inspection. But, by and large, it's not something that they do. They generally leave that up to state boards of pharmacy. So.
Um, Talk a little bit about AI. Of course, everybody's talking about AI and all aspects of our lives, but I know Langham is employed some AI powered drone systems. And just talk about, and maybe other technologies as well, but particularly on the AI side, kind of how you guys have implemented that, sort of what changes that has driven kind of how you guys operate.
Yeah, I would say the drones that we use to verify inventory are probably the largest item that we've implemented to date. So that's a very sophisticated system that allows us to go through and do verification for especially for items that we put away. Making sure that we have the right pallets in the right locations and things like that. So we utilize that to supplement our normal cycle count program. I would say that's the largest thing that we have on the AI front at the moment. And I use the term AI a little bit loosely with that particular system. And as far as other areas are concerned, um, Kathy, the owner and founder of Langham, likes to say that from a technology perspective, we are not leading, cutting edge, but we are definitely fast followers. We like to see how certain technologies, especially new things like this, vet out in the industry before we really commit to it. So we're currently in the process of exploring other options for AI. We've implemented it in sort of some front office fashions, to date. So we kind of loosely use, Copilot to help with meetings and do transcriptions and things like that. We have explored utilizing AI to take some of our procedures and translate them so that we have bilingual or multilingual SOPs. So that's something that we're currently exploring. Um, and We actually have an initiative this summer through our IT group to learn more about AI specifically and how we can better implement that throughout the organization to maybe gain some efficiency.
Thinking about, like we mentioned up front, where logistics covers, right? I mean, everything in our lives, logistics plays a role. Um, someone just entering the space, and I asked this not to, you know, give away trade secrets, to give away the farm, but advice you would give those folks, or maybe even things that they should avoid, moving into this regulated space within logistics.
I'm going to stand with you with patient safety. Remember that you are on the front line of patient safety. You have a duty and an obligation to protect the product, the safety, identity, strength, purity, and quality of the product, because somebody at some point is going to take that medication and as a therapeutic. And so you need to keep that at the forefront of your mind. And if that's not part of your mission, it should be. And the second, I would say, I would reiterate quality by design for facilities. I cannot stress that enough, specifically because of the first point. It there are a lot of logistics companies that I've worked with in the past that will take a spec building, throw some HVAC system, HVAC units on the roof, temperature map it, and call it good. And while you might, be technically compliant to the letter of the guidance or standard or whatever customer you have, are you truly mitigating risk to the end user? Are you really implementing a um, quality facility, and are you really taking risk management seriously? Thorough, robust change management. This is one of those things that logistics companies traditionally have struggled with, at least in my experience in my past. We've done a fairly good job with change management at Langham, which I'm very proud of. But making sure that the changes are thoroughly documented, and you are assessing impacts to all the various systems and stakeholders that you may have to deal with. That's extremely important. Logistics is fast paced, so we want to make fast decisions, and of course you need to do that in order to serve your customers, because sometimes they have urgent needs. But at the same time, we also have to make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable to this change control standards that are both regulatory and voluntary standard requirements. So having a QMS that really meets regulatory and voluntary standards, so making sure your QMS is compliant with 21 CFR. You might have to comply with some international regulations as well. So, looking at Udrlex or European Commission regulations, that's certainly important. Designing a QMS around, ISO 9001, USP 1079, those things are international standards for a reason. And so just making sure that you've got a good, solid foundation for a quality management system. And I would say that, also just remembering that quality management is everybody's business. It's everybody's job. Function of the quality department within your organization is oversight to make sure that everybody's contributing to it. So I think, that's certainly very important. No, just avoid cutting corners. Remember, you're on the front line of patient safety.
Yeah, and I think that's a great list. Moving into my last question, probably address this one throughout, but summing that up, kind of one takeaway. Maybe you hope that listeners bring from this conversation that you'd like them to take forward in terms of quality within this life science logistics space.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say from my last response, I would reiterate that quality is everybody's business. Everybody is a quality professional in this space. The department's role is oversight to make sure it happens. But you can't forget that even though you're trying to get a critical shipment out the door, that you still have to keep quality at the forefront of what you're doing. And I would reiterate again. Logistics organizations handling finished pharmaceuticals, medical devices, critical items for patients. You are on the front line of patient safety. You have a direct influence and impact on somebody else's life. And you have to keep that in the forefront of your mind. I think I said this earlier, but it bears repeating that external warehousing and transportation are among the highest risk operations in the pharmaceutical supply chain. And so everything you do as an organization will affect the quality of life for someone else at some point. You have a duty or obligation to maintain the highest standard of care when it comes to the service you provide.
Yeah, not very well put. No, Sean, I appreciate you being here today and sharing your experience. Clear that bridging that gap between logistics and manufacturing. It's not just good processes. It's that quality mindset. That you mentioned several times. Of course, willingness to adapt to change. But whether you're a manufacturer, a logistics provider, equipment supplier, service provider, playing any other role in that process, if the goal is the same: safe, effective products delivered without quality compromise. Of course, that only happens when quality and compliance are part of that conversation from the start and really ingrained in the conversation, ingrained in the culture. So. Yeah, I think that puts a wrap on today's conversation. So, thanks again, Sean, for this conversation. And, thanks everyone for joining us. And we'll see you next time on Beyond the Checklist.
Thanks for having me, Brad. I appreciate the time.
Thanks, Sean.
This episode is brought to you by Performance Validation, your validation partner for what's next. Best-in-class, CGMP-compliant validation for pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical devices manufacturing. With more than 3 decades of experience, Performance Validation helps you streamline using innovative approaches that balance production realities with strict regulatory requirements for quality, safety, and compliance. Learn more at www.perfval.com.